When Caleb Rourke offered his last $50 to marry a stranger in a torn wedding dress, he wasn't thinking about love. He was thinking about survival. Lila Warren had been rejected on a Montana platform for being too fat, left weeping while her mail-order groom rode away with another woman. Caleb's ranch was 30 days from foreclosure. His cattle were vanishing in the night, and a land baron circled like a vulture. Two desperate people. One impossible gamble. A marriage born from shame and necessity that would either save them both or bury them in the unforgiving Montana winter. Before we begin this story of second chances and hidden silver, please comment below with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales of the Old West travel. The November wind cut across the Billings platform like a skinning knife, sharp enough to make a man's eyes water. Caleb Rourke stood with his hat pulled low, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, watching the afternoon train hiss and clank as passengers climbed aboard. He'd come to town for fence wire and lamp oil, supplies he couldn't really afford but needed anyway, and now he was stalling, putting off the ride back to a ranch that felt more like a slowly sinking ship every damn day. That's when he saw her. She sat on a bench near the station house, alone, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her dress had probably been beautiful once, cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, but now it was torn at the hem, stained with platform dust, and wrinkled from what looked like a long, hard journey. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, falling around a round, flushed face. She clutched a carpetbag to her chest like it was the only thing keeping her from flying apart. Caleb had seen enough abandoned brides to recognize the signs. The territorial papers ran advertisements every week. Honest rancher seeks hard-working wife. Widower with children needs motherly woman. Prosperous merchant desires refined lady. Half the women who answered those ads found exactly what they'd been promised. The other half found men who'd stretched the truth like cheap canvas, or worse, men who took one look at what stepped off the train and decided the deal was off. He should have walked away. He had enough problems without adding someone else's heartbreak to the pile. But something about the way she sat there, not wailing or making a scene, just quietly trying to hold herself together, made him pause. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "You all right?" She looked up and he saw her eyes were red-rimmed but fierce. "Do I look all right to you?" "Fair point." "Sorry, stupid question." He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how threadbare his own coat was, how his boots had been resoled twice and wouldn't make it through another winter. You need help? Someone I can fetch for you?" "The man I came here to marry took one look at me and said I wasn't what he ordered." Her voice was steady despite the tears still tracking down her cheeks. "Said I was too fat. Said the tintype I sent must have been someone else, or taken years ago, or maybe I'd eaten my way across 3 states since mailing it. Then he got on his horse with a woman named Belle, who was apparently waiting for him at his ranch the whole time, and told me I could take the next train back east or figure something else out because he sure as hell wasn't marrying me." Caleb felt anger kindle in his chest. He'd known Martin Hendricks casually, enough to nod to in the mercantile, enough to know the man ran sheep in the high country. He'd always seemed like an asshole, and now Caleb knew for certain. "That's a hell of a thing to do to someone," he said quietly. "A hell of a thing?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I sold everything I owned to buy the train ticket. I gave up my job at the textile mill. I told my landlady I wouldn't be coming back. I packed my entire life into 2 bags and came 2,000 miles to marry a man who couldn't even pretend to be decent for 5 minutes." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "So yes, it's a hell of a thing." The train whistle blew, 3 short blasts that meant final boarding. The conductor walked the platform, calling out destinations. In 5 minutes, the train would pull away, and this woman would either be on it or she wouldn't. Caleb knew what he should do. Offer her money for a ticket. Maybe walk her to the church, see if the preacher's wife could take her in until she figured out her next move. That was the decent thing, the sensible thing. Instead, he heard himself say, "What's your name?" She blinked at him, surprised. Lila Warren." "I'm Caleb Rourke. I run a cattle ranch about 8 miles north of here." He took a breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff. "I came to town for supplies, but what I really need is a wife. I'm 30 days from losing everything I own, Miss Warren. The bank's ready to foreclose, I'm down to my last $50, and I've got more problems than I can count on both hands. I can't promise you much. Not comfort, not security, not even decent odds we'll make it through to spring. But if you're willing to work hard, if you can handle a rough life in rough country, I can promise you this. I don't drink, I don't hit, and I won't ever look at you the way that bastard Hendricks did. Lila stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. You're proposing marriage, to me, right now. I know it sounds crazy, but it sounds insane. But we're both desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. He pulled off his hat, running a hand through his hair. Look, I'm not offering you a fairy tale. I'm offering you a partnership, a chance to work towards something instead of running back to whatever you left behind. You want to interview me first, ask me questions, make sure I'm not some kind of lunatic? That's fine. We can sit right here and you can interrogate me until the next train comes through tomorrow. But if you think there's even a chance you might say yes, we need to decide now, because that's the preacher walking past. And if we're going to do this, we need to do it legal. Lila looked at the train, then back at him, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her voice was all business. Do you drink? No, ma'am. Do you hit? Never have, never will. Do you gamble? Can't afford to. Are you running from the law? Wanted for anything? No. The only thing chasing me is debt, and that's legal and documented. You said you have problems you can't count. List them. Caleb almost smiled. Most women in her position would be too rattled to think straight, but she was interviewing him like a factory boss sizing up a new hire. He appreciated that. I'm losing cattle, he said bluntly. Started 6 months ago. A few head here and there, then more, then enough that I can't pretend it's just coyotes or strays. I'm down to 43 head when I should have closer to 70. My foreman says there's no tracks, no blood, nothing to follow. They just vanish. Meanwhile, the bank's breathing down my neck because I took a loan 3 years back to expand the herd and improve the land, and I can't make the payments without selling cattle I don't have anymore. How much do you owe? $1,600. How much is the ranch worth? Appraised at $4,500 last year. But land values have dropped since then, and the bank knows I'm desperate. They'll take it for whatever they can get and sell it to someone with cash. Who's trying to buy it? That was a sharper question than he'd expected. What makes you think someone's trying to buy it? Because that's how these things work. Lila's eyes were dry now, focused. A man doesn't lose that many cattle without someone benefiting. If rustlers are taking them, they're selling them somewhere. If someone wants your land, they'll make sure you can't keep it. So who's been circling? Victor Langford runs the biggest spread in 3 counties. He's offered to help me out twice in the last month, both times with offers so low they were basically insults. Then he's either stealing your cattle or knows who is. She said it matter-of-factly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. What else? The ranch is in rough shape. House needs work, barn needs work, fences need work. I've been doing what I can, but I'm one man trying to do the job of 3. My foreman Isaiah is good people, but he's got his own spread to manage. He helps when he can, but that's not enough. You need workers. Can't afford workers. You need money. Can't get money without cattle to sell. So you need someone who can think, work, and doesn't need a salary. Lila stood up, smoothing her ruined dress. She was shorter than he'd thought, barely came up to his shoulder, but there was steel in the way she held herself. And you think I'm that person. I think you're smart enough to see the angles. I think you've worked hard your whole life and aren't afraid to keep working. And I think you've got nothing to lose and everything to gain, same as me. The train whistle blew again, one long, final warning. The conductor was closing doors, shouting last calls. In 60 seconds, the decision would be made for both of them. Lila picked up her carpet bag. For a moment, Caleb thought she was going to walk toward the train, and he'd spend the rest of his short-lived ranching career wondering what might have been. Instead, she held out her hand. All right, Mr. Rourke, I'll marry you, but I want it understood from the start. I pull my weight. I expect you to pull yours. We work together or we don't work at all. And if you ever treat me the way Martin Hendricks treated me today, I will leave you so fast your head will spin, and I will take half of whatever we've built together. We clear? Caleb shook her hand, her grip firm and dry. Crystal clear, Miss Warren. Then let's go find that preacher before I come to my senses. Reverend Thomas Whitaker married them in the parsonage parlor with his wife as witness. The whole ceremony took 10 minutes. Caleb produced a thin gold band that had belonged to his mother. He'd been carrying it for 3 years, ever since he'd first thought about answering one of those mail-order advertisements himself, and slid it onto Lila's finger. She stared at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you man and wife. Reverend Whitaker closed his Bible with a soft thump. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Rourke. Caleb hesitated, suddenly aware that he was about to kiss a woman whose last name he'd learned 20 minutes ago. But Lila stepped forward, rose on her toes, and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek. There, she said quietly. That's done. Mrs. Whitaker insisted on giving them a basket of bread and preserves for your wedding supper, and Reverend Whitaker shook Caleb's hand with the kind of concerned grip that said he thought this was either the bravest or stupidest thing he'd seen all year. Probably both. Then they were outside, standing in the cold afternoon light, officially married. The wagon's this way, Caleb said, and started walking. Lila followed, her carpet bag clutched in both hands. Neither of them said much as they loaded her belongings, which amounted to the carpet bag and one battered trunk, into the wagon bed. Caleb had already loaded his supplies, so they were ready to go. He helped her up onto the bench, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses, a matched pair of bays named Sam and Blue, leaned into their collars, and the wagon rolled forward with a creak and rattle. They were half a mile out of town before Lila spoke again. What's the ranch called? Doesn't have a fancy name, just the Rourke place. How long have you owned it? 5 years. My father left it to me when he passed. He'd worked it for 20 years before that, built it up from nothing. I was going to expand, make it into something bigger. That's why I took the loan, to buy more breeding stock, improve the grazing land, put in better water systems. He kept his eyes on the road. Guess that didn't work out the way I planned. Not yet, Lila said. But the bank hasn't taken it yet either. He glanced at her. She was staring straight ahead, her expression thoughtful. You really think we can turn this around? I think we're going to try. She adjusted her shawl against the wind. Tell me about this foreman of yours. Isaiah, you said. Isaiah Boone. He's got a small spread about 3 miles east. He worked for my father back in the day, taught me most of what I know about cattle and horses. When I took over, he helped me get established, and I helped him start his own place. We work together when we can. He'll come help with roundup. I'll help him with haying, that kind of thing. Is he trustworthy? With my life. Good. We're going to need him. The road climbed into the foothills, winding through stands of pine and aspen. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already white with snow. It was beautiful country, Caleb thought. Hard and unforgiving, but beautiful. The kind of place that broke weak people and made strong people stronger. He hoped to God he and Lila were strong enough. Tell me about Victor Langford, Lila said suddenly. What do you want to know? Everything. How long has he been here? How did he get his money? Who's afraid of him and why? Caleb took a breath, organizing his thoughts. Langford came to Montana about 10 years ago with money, a lot of it, from back east somewhere. He bought up land when prices were low, brought in huge herds, hired men who knew how to work cattle and weren't afraid to work hard. Built himself an empire, basically. He's got ranches in 3 counties, owns part of the bank in Billings, has fingers in mining operations, timber, freight contracts. If there's money to be made in Montana, Victor Langford's making it. And he wants your ranch. He wants everyone's ranch. He's been buying up smaller spreads for years, always offering just enough to make it seem generous, but never enough to actually reflect the land's real value. Most people take the deal because they're desperate, and Langford knows it. He's patient. He'll wait you out, watch you struggle, then swoop in when you're at your weakest. He's a vulture. He's a businessman, and he's good at it. Is he behind the rustling? Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. I don't know. I've got no proof, nothing that would hold up in court. But the timing's suspicious. The cattle started disappearing right around the time Langford made his first offer. Could be coincidence. Could be strategy. It's strategy, Lila said flatly. He's making sure you can't pay the bank so he can buy the land cheap when you lose it. Then he'll turn around and make back twice what he paid within a year. It's not even creative, it's just mean. You sound like you've seen this before. I worked in a textile mill for 6 years. I saw how owners operated, how they'd cut wages or create shortages to justify layoffs, then hire people back at half the rate. It's the same game, just a different field. She turned to look at him. How much time do we have? 30 days until the banknote's due. If I can't make the payment, they foreclose. How much is the payment? $400. Lila was quiet for a moment, thinking. How much can we get for a cow? Depends on the market. Maybe $20 a head if we can get them to the railhead in Denver. Less if we sell local. So we need 20 head to make the payment. 20 head we don't have. And even if we did, it takes time to drive cattle to Denver. Time we don't have. Then we make time. Lila's voice was firm. We count every animal you've got, we figure out exactly what we're working with, and we make a plan. We've got 30 days, Mr. Rourke. That's 30 days to save your ranch, 30 days to prove that desperate people can do impossible things. And if Victor Langford thinks he's going to steal what's yours without a fight, he's about to learn different. Caleb looked at his new wife, this woman he'd known for less than an hour, who'd been abandoned and humiliated and left with nothing, and who was now talking about fighting one of the most powerful men in Montana, and felt something shift in his chest. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was insanity. But for the first time in months, he didn't feel quite so alone. We're here, he said, as the wagon crested a rise and the ranch came into view below. It wasn't much to look at. The house was small, 4 rooms if you counted the lean-to kitchen, with a sagging porch and shutters that needed paint. The barn was bigger, at least, solid timber construction with a good roof, but the corral fences were patched in 3 places, and the hay shed was missing half its boards. Beyond the buildings, the pasture rolled away toward the mountains, brown grass rippling in the wind. A thin line of cottonwoods marked where the creek ran through the property, and somewhere beyond that, up in the high country, was where the cattle should be. Should be, but probably weren't all there. Lila didn't say anything as Caleb drove the wagon into the yard and pulled up in front of the house. She just sat there, taking it all in with those sharp eyes. It needs work, Caleb said, feeling suddenly defensive. I know it's not much. It's fine. Lila climbed down from the wagon before he could help her. I've lived in a tenement with 8 other girls in 1 bathtub. Believe me, this is fine. She walked toward the house, then stopped and looked back at him. Are you coming? I'd like to see what we're working with. Inside, the house was cold and dim. Caleb lit a lamp and weak light spilled across the main room. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a pair of sagging armchairs near the hearth. A door led to the bedroom, another to the kitchen lean-to. The whole place smelled faintly of wood smoke and bacon grease. Lila set her carpet bag on the table and started walking through the rooms, opening cupboards, checking shelves, peering into the cold stove. Caleb followed her, feeling like a child being inspected by a schoolteacher. When did you last buy supplies? She asked, staring into the nearly empty pantry. Last month. I've been rationing. You've been starving yourself. She pulled out a can of beans, a half-empty bag of flour, a tiny sack of coffee. This isn't rationing, Mr. Rourke. This is desperation. I've been spending money on feed for the cattle. They need it more than I do. They need a living rancher more than they need an extra bale of hay. She turned to face him, hands on her hips. We're going to make a list of everything you need, food, supplies, equipment, and we're going to prioritize. You can't work if you're half-starved, and I can't help you if I'm weak from hunger. First rule of survival, take care of the people, then take care of the animals. I don't have money for... You said you have $50. That's for the bank payment. The bank payment is $400. $50 won't make a dent, but $50 can buy food and lamp oil and the things we need to stay alive while we figure out how to make $400. She softened her tone slightly. I know you're trying to hold on to every penny, but you can't save the ranch if you're dead, Caleb. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something about hearing it made the whole situation feel suddenly, impossibly real. He'd married a stranger. He'd brought her home to a failing ranch with no money, no prospects, and 30 days until disaster. And now she was standing in his kitchen, telling him how to spend his last $50, and somehow, it didn't feel wrong. All right, he said quietly. We'll make a list. They spent the next hour taking inventory. Lila wrote everything down in a small leather journal she pulled from her carpet bag, her handwriting neat and precise. Caleb watched her work, noticing details he'd missed before. The way she chewed her lower lip when she was thinking, the faint scar on her left hand, the way her eyes narrowed when the numbers didn't add up the way she expected. You're good with figures, he said. I kept the books at the mill. The owner was lazy, so I ended up managing inventory, tracking orders, reconciling accounts. It's just numbers. You pay attention. You stay organized. They make sense. She tapped the journal. According to this, you're spending too much on hay and not enough on salt licks, and your feed supplier is overcharging you by at least 15%. How can you tell? Because I looked at the receipts you've got shoved in that drawer, and I know what things cost. He's taking advantage, probably because he knows you're desperate. She made a note. We'll deal with that later. Right now, I need to see the cattle. How do we get to them? We ride out. It's about a 2-mile ride to where they're grazing. Then let's go. Now? It's getting late. We have 30 days, Caleb. We don't have time to wait for perfect conditions. I need to see what we're working with, and I need to see it today. She had a point. Caleb nodded, then went to saddle the horses while Lila changed out of her ruined wedding dress and into a simple wool skirt and jacket she pulled from her trunk. When she came out to the barn, she looked more like a ranch woman and less like an abandoned bride. The transformation was startling. You ride? He asked, leading out a gray mare named Josie. I grew up on a farm in Ohio before my parents died. I know my way around horses. She took the reins, checked the girth, then swung up into the saddle with practiced ease. Let's go. They rode north, following a faint trail that wound through the pasture and up into the hills. The wind was picking up, carrying the scent of pine and coming snow. Caleb pointed out landmarks as they went. The creek, the boundary markers, the high meadow where the cattle should be. When they reached the grazing area, Caleb felt his stomach drop. The herd was smaller than he'd thought. 43 head, maybe fewer. They were scattered across the slope, grazing on sparse grass, their ribs showing even through their winter coats. Lila rode slowly through the herd, counting, assessing. When she came back, her expression was grim. 41, she said. I counted twice. You've lost 2 more since the last time you checked. God damn it! Caleb slammed his fist against his saddle horn. I was up here 3 days ago. They were all accounted for. Then someone's working fast. Lila turned her horse in a slow circle, studying the landscape. Where do they normally take them? That's the thing. There's no pattern, no tracks, no signs of a drive. They just vanish. Nothing vanishes. People just aren't looking in the right places. She pointed toward the north, where the land rose into rougher country. What's up there? Canyons, rough terrain, hard to navigate. It's mostly Langford's land once you cross the ridge. Have you ridden up there? Not recently. There's no reason to. The cattle don't go that far on their own, and it's not grazing land. Maybe there's reason to now. Lila kneed her horse forward, heading toward the ridge. Come on! Lila, wait! But she was already moving, and Caleb had no choice but to follow. They climbed into the hills, the horses picking their way over rocky ground. The sun was sinking toward the mountains, painting the sky orange and gold. In another hour, it would be full dark, and these hills weren't safe to navigate in the dark. We need to turn back, Caleb called. Just a little farther. They crested the ridge, and Lila reined in hard. Below them, a canyon cut deep into the earth, its walls steep and shadowed. At the bottom, barely visible in the fading light, was a narrow trail. There, Lila said, pointing. That's where they're taking them. Caleb squinted, trying to see what she saw. I don't see anything. Look at the ground. The rocks are disturbed. See how they're lighter on one side, like something's been moving through here regularly? And there, near that scrub pine, the branches are broken at cow height. She turned to him. Someone's driving cattle through here, Caleb. They're using this canyon to move them off your land without leaving tracks you'd notice from the grazing area. If you're right, where are they taking them? Only one way to find out. She started to urge her horse down the slope, but Caleb caught her reins. Not tonight. It's too dark, too dangerous. We'll come back tomorrow, first light, with Isaiah. If someone's stealing my cattle, I want to catch them in the act, but I want backup when I do it. Lila looked like she wanted to argue, but finally nodded. First light, and we bring weapons. We bring weapons, Caleb agreed. They rode back to the ranch in silence, both of them lost in thought. By the time they got back, the stars were out, bright and cold in the November sky. Caleb unsaddled the horses and fed them while Lila went inside to start a fire. When he came in, she had the stove lit and was working on something that smelled like frying bacon. Found some eggs in the barn, she said, not looking up from the pan. They're probably half frozen, but they'll do. And I made coffee. It's terrible, but it's hot. Caleb poured himself a cup and sat at the table, watching her work. She moved with efficiency, no wasted motion, like someone who'd spent years cooking in cramped spaces with limited supplies. In minutes, she had plates on the table, bacon, scrambled eggs, toasted bread spread with the preserves from the preacher's wife. It's not much, she said, sitting across from him. It's the best meal I've had in weeks. And it was. Not because the food was fancy, but because for the first time in months, Caleb wasn't eating alone. They ate in comfortable silence, and then Lila started cleaning up. Caleb stood to help, but she waved him off. You've been working all day. I've got this. So have you. I've been sitting on a train and then a wagon bench, hardly the same as running a ranch. She glanced at him. Besides, we're partners, remember? You do some things, I do some things, and together we get everything done. Partners. Caleb liked the sound of that. When the dishes were washed and put away, they stood awkwardly in the main room, both suddenly aware that they were married and there was one bedroom in the house. I'll sleep out here, Caleb said quickly. You take the bed. That's ridiculous. It's freezing in here. The bedroom will hold heat better. I'm not going to... I know you're not. Lila's voice was firm, but not unkind. We made a deal, and I trust you to keep it. But we're both adults, we're both exhausted, and we both need sleep if we're going to save this ranch. The bed's big enough for 2 people to sleep without touching. We'll put a line of blankets down the middle if it makes you feel better. It did make him feel better, actually. They ended up doing exactly that, a rolled blanket down the center of the bed, creating a clear boundary. Caleb lay on his side, fully clothed except for his boots, staring at the ceiling. Lila lay on hers, so still he almost thought she'd fallen asleep immediately. Then she spoke, her voice quiet in the darkness. Caleb? Yeah? Thank you, for today, for giving me a chance when I had nothing left. You're giving me a chance too, we're even. Maybe we are. She was quiet for a moment. I won't let you down. I know. And I won't let Langford win. I know that too. She didn't say anything else, and after a while, her breathing deepened into sleep. Caleb lay awake a while longer, thinking about the day, how it had started with desperation and ended with something that felt almost like hope. He'd married a stranger. He'd brought her home to disaster. And somehow, against all odds, it felt like the first smart decision he'd made in a long time. Tomorrow, they'd ride into the canyons. Tomorrow, they'd start fighting back. Tomorrow, they'd begin the impossible work of saving a ranch that was already halfway to ruin. But tonight, for the first time in months, Caleb Rourke wasn't alone. And in the hard country of Montana, sometimes that was enough to keep a man going. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him, the sound of Lila's breathing steady and sure in the darkness beside him. Dawn came cold and pale, the sun a dim coin behind the mountain peaks. Caleb woke to find Lila already up, dressed, and standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in her hands. She'd braided her hair back tight and wore the same practical wool she'd had on yesterday. When she heard him stirring, she turned. I made coffee and biscuits. We should eat before we ride out. You didn't have to. Partners, remember? She set a plate in front of him. Besides, I'm not going into those canyons on an empty stomach. If we're going to find your cattle and whoever's taking them, I want to be sharp. The biscuits were dense but good, baked in the cast iron skillet over the stove. They ate quickly, not talking much, both of them focused on what lay ahead. When they were done, Caleb went to get his rifle from the cabinet near the door. It was a Winchester repeater, well-maintained and loaded. He checked the action, then looked at Lila. You said you grew up on a farm. You know how to shoot? My father taught me. I'm not going to win any competitions, but I can hit what I'm aiming at if I have to. He handed her his old Colt revolver, the one he'd carried during the war. Safety's here. Don't use it unless you absolutely have to, but don't hesitate if things go bad. These men, if they're really stealing cattle, they're not going to just surrender because we ask nicely. Lila took the gun, checked the cylinder, then tucked it into her jacket pocket. Understood. They rode out just as the sun was clearing the peaks, the air so cold it burned going down. The horses' breath came in white plumes and frost crunched under their hooves. Caleb had sent word to Isaiah the night before, a note left at his place asking him to meet them at the North Ridge. And sure enough, when they reached the high ground, Isaiah was already there, sitting his roan gelding with the patient stillness of a man who'd spent his life working cattle. Isaiah Boone was 53, weathered as old leather, with gray shot through his dark hair and beard. He'd been a cavalry scout before the war, a trail boss after, and now ran a small but prosperous ranch with his 2 grown sons. He studied Lila with frank curiosity as they approached. "So you're the bride Martin Hendricks threw away," he said, his voice a low rumble. "His loss, I'd say. Any woman who marries Caleb knowing what he's up against is either crazy or brave, and I'm betting on brave." "I'm betting on desperate," Lila said dryly. "Same as him, but desperate people make things happen, Mr. Boone." Isaiah's weathered face cracked into a grin. "I like her already, and it's Isaiah. We don't stand on ceremony out here." He turned to Caleb. "So what are we doing? Your note said you found something." Caleb nodded toward the canyon. "Lila spotted what I missed. Someone's been moving cattle through there, probably at night, probably for months. I want to see where the trail leads and who's at the other end of it. And if we find them, we get proof, evidence we can take to the sheriff. I want these bastards behind bars, not just run off where they can come back and try again." Isaiah pulled his rifle from its scabbard and laid it across his saddle. "Then let's go hunting." They descended into the canyon in single file, the horses picking their way carefully over loose rock and patches of ice. The walls rose steep on either side, cutting off most of the morning light, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shadows. The trail Lila had spotted was clearer now, a narrow path worn smooth by repeated passage, marked here and there with disturbed stones and broken brush. "She's right," Isaiah said, studying the ground. "Something big's been through here, and recently. See how the dirt's still loose in the hoof prints? That's maybe 2-3 days old at most." They followed the trail deeper into the canyon, around 2 bends and through a narrow defile that barely gave the horses room to pass. Then the canyon opened up into a wider space, almost a hidden valley, where the walls pulled back and scrub pine grew in sparse clusters. And there, penned in a makeshift corral built from deadfall and rope, were cattle. Caleb recognized his brand immediately. The R over anchor his father had designed 30 years ago, burned clear on the left hip. He counted quickly, 8 head, all of them from his herd, all of them looking thin and agitated from being confined. "Sons of bitches," Isaiah breathed. "They've been holding them here, probably until they can get enough to make a drive worth their time." "Or rebrand them," Lila said quietly. She pointed to a smoldering campfire near the corral. "Someone's been here recently. Look, the ashes are still warm." The words were barely out of her mouth when a voice called out from the rocks above. "That's far enough, Rourke." 3 men stepped into view, rifles already raised. Caleb recognized 2 of them immediately, Chet Bowman and Frank Ridley, men who worked for Victor Langford. The third was younger, maybe 20, with a nervous face and hands that shook slightly on his gun. "You're trespassing," Chet said. He was a big man, thick through the shoulders, with a scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. "This here's private land." "This is Langford's land," Caleb said evenly. "And those are my cattle in that pen." "Don't know what you're talking about. These are strays we found wandering around. We're just holding them until we can figure out who they belong to." "They've got my brand on them, Chet. You planning to claim you didn't notice that?" "Brands can be faked." Chet's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe you're the one trying to steal cattle, coming onto Mr. Langford's property and making claims you can't back up." Lila's voice cut through the standoff, sharp and clear. "There's warm ash in that fire, fresh rope on that corral, and I'm willing to bet if we dig around a bit, we'll find running irons and enough evidence to hang all 3 of you for rustling. You want to keep lying, or you want to tell us who's giving you orders?" Chet's eyes flicked to her, and his expression turned ugly. "Well, look at that. The fat bride's got a mouth on her. Hendricks was smart to send you packing, lady. You're not fit for—" Isaiah's rifle was up and pointed before Chet could finish the sentence. "Next word out of your mouth is going to be your last, Bowman. The lady asked you a question. Answer it, or I'll assume you're guilty as hell, and we'll settle this right now." The young man's rifle wavered. "Chet, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Danny." Chet's face was red, veins standing out on his neck. "You think you're going to waltz in here and take what's ours? Langford owns this county. He owns the bank. He owns the sheriff. He owns everything. You're finished, Rourke. All three of you are finished." "So Langford is behind this," Caleb said. "Good to know. Knowing doesn't change anything. You can't prove nothing. Now get off this land before—" What happened next happened fast. Frank Ridley, who'd been silent until now, suddenly swung his rifle toward Lila. Maybe he thought she was the weakest target. Maybe he was just mean. But before he could fire, Lila's hand came out of her jacket with the Colt, and she shot him. The bullet caught Frank in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping his rifle. He went down hard, screaming, and all hell broke loose. Chet fired at Caleb, the bullet whining off a rock near his head. Caleb dove from his saddle, hit the ground rolling, and came up with his Winchester. He put a round over Chet's head, a warning shot, and yelled, "Drop it, or the next one goes through you." Danny, the young one, threw his rifle down immediately and raised his hands. "Don't shoot! I'm done! I'm out!" Chet looked at Frank writhing on the ground, at Danny with his hands up, at Isaiah's rifle still trained on him. Then he lowered his gun and spat on the ground. "This isn't over." "Yeah," Caleb said, walking forward to kick Chet's rifle away. "It is." They tied the three rustlers with rope from the makeshift corral, then tended to Frank's wound. Lila had shot clean through the meat of his shoulder, missing bone and artery. She wrapped it efficiently while Frank glared at her and called her names she ignored with icy calm. "You're lucky I aimed for your shoulder," she told him flatly. "I was considering your knee." Isaiah laughed at that, a sharp bark of genuine amusement. "Caleb, you married a hell of a woman." "I'm starting to see that." They loaded Frank onto his horse, hands tied to the saddle horn, and put Chet and Danny on their mounts the same way. Then they rounded up the stolen cattle and started the slow drive back toward town. It took most of the morning to navigate the canyon trail, and by the time they reached the main road, Caleb's mind was racing ahead to the next problem. "Chet said Langford owns the sheriff," he said to Isaiah as they rode. "If that's true, riding into town with his men tied up might not go the way we hope." "Langford's got influence," Isaiah agreed, "but he doesn't own everyone. Sheriff Dugan's been around longer than Langford has, and he's got a reputation for being fair. Besides, we've got witnesses, we've got stolen cattle with your brand, and we've got 3 men caught red-handed. That's hard to argue with. Unless Langford argues with money and lawyers. Then we make sure the whole town knows what happened before Langford can spin his version." Isaiah glanced at Lila. "Your wife's got the right idea. Get ahead of the story." Lila, riding just ahead, turned in her saddle. "We don't just go to the sheriff. We go to the newspaper. We go to the church. We make sure everyone in Billings knows that Victor Langford's been stealing cattle and using hired thugs to drive honest ranchers off their land. We make it loud, we make it public, and we make it impossible for him to bury." "That'll make him even more dangerous," Caleb warned. "He's already dangerous, but right now, he's also exposed." Lila's eyes were hard. "We hit him while he's vulnerable, or he'll hit us first." They rode into Billings just after noon, driving 8 stolen cattle down Main Street with 3 tied-up rustlers in tow. People stopped and stared. Conversations died mid-sentence. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, they had an audience. Sheriff Tom Dugan came out onto the boardwalk, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, squinting at the procession. He was in his 60s, grizzled and bow-legged, with a drooping mustache and eyes that missed nothing. "Caleb Rourke," he said slowly. "That's quite an entrance. You want to tell me what's going on?" "These 3 men are rustlers," Caleb said, dismounting. "Caught them red-handed with my cattle penned up in a canyon on Langford's property. They admitted they were working for him. I want them arrested and charged." Dugan's eyes moved to Chet, then to the bleeding Frank, then to Danny, who looked like he wanted to sink through the earth. "That true, Bowman?" "Langford's going to hear about this," Chet snarled. "You arrest us. You're making an enemy you can't afford." I'll take that as a yes. Dugan gestured to his deputy, a lanky kid named Pete. Get them inside and into cells, then fetch Doc Morrison for that shoulder wound. He turned back to Caleb. You've got proof? Witnesses? Isaiah Boone was with me. So was my wife. Caleb gestured to Lila, who was climbing down from her horse. She's the one who shot Frank. Self-defense. He was aiming at her. Dugan looked at Lila with interest. You're new in town. Lila Rourke. I married Caleb yesterday. She pulled the Colt from her pocket and handed it to the sheriff, butt first. I shot Frank Ridley when he pointed his rifle at me. The bullet's in his shoulder. I can show you the angle if you need confirmation of my account. Dugan took the gun, checked it, then handed it back. I've known Frank Ridley for 10 years. He's mean as a snake and twice as quick to bite. You shot him. I'm guessing he earned it. He looked at the cattle milling in the street. Those yours, Caleb? Rover Anchor brand. You can check the registry if you want confirmation. I will. Dugan rubbed his jaw, thinking. This is going to stir up trouble. Langford's not going to take kindly to having his men arrested, even if they were caught stealing. Then he should have hired better men, Isaiah said. Or maybe he should have thought twice before trying to run good people off their land. A crowd had gathered, shopkeepers, ranchers, townspeople drawn by the commotion. Caleb saw the editor of the Billings Gazette, a thin man named Arthur Penn, scribbling furiously in a notebook. He saw Reverend Whitaker and his wife watching from across the street. He saw other ranchers he knew, men who'd probably had cattle stolen themselves and couldn't prove it. Lila stepped up onto the boardwalk, raising her voice so the whole street could hear. My name is Lila Rourke, and yesterday I married a man I'd never met because he was honest and desperate, which made him better than the man who'd brought me to Montana just to reject me. I came to a ranch that's being stolen piece by piece, not by bad luck, but by calculated theft. We found proof this morning. We found the men doing it, and we found that they work for Victor Langford, who's been driving ranchers off their land so he can buy it cheap and take what's theirs. If anyone here has lost cattle, if anyone here has been pressured to sell, if anyone here has wondered why their luck turned bad right when Langford started making offers, this is why, and we're not going to let him get away with it anymore. The crowd stirred, murmuring. Arthur Penn's pencil flew across his notebook. Reverend Whitaker nodded slowly, his face grave. Then a voice cut through the noise, cold and smooth as ice on steel. That's quite a speech, Mrs. Rourke, passionate certainly, but passion isn't proof. Victor Langford stepped out of the crowd like a shark parting water. He was tall, well-dressed in a tailored coat and polished boots, with silver hair and a handsome face that smiled without warmth. Two more of his men flanked him, hands near their guns. Sheriff Dugan, Langford said pleasantly, I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding. My men were apparently found with some stray cattle. They weren't strays, Caleb said flatly. They were penned up in a corral on your land, and your men were guarding them. My land is vast, Mr. Rourke. I can hardly be held responsible for every stray animal that wanders onto it. If my men were holding cattle they believed to be strays, they were simply doing their job. They admitted to theft, Isaiah said. We were there. We heard them. Hearsay. Langford's smile widened. In any case, I'm sure this can all be sorted out in court. In the meantime, Sheriff, I trust you'll treat my employees fairly. They're good men who've been unjustly accused. Your employees shot at us, Lila said, her voice cutting. Or are you going to claim that was a misunderstanding too? Langford's gaze moved to her, and for the first time something flickered in his eyes. Calculation. Reassessment. And you are? The woman who married Caleb Rourke. The woman who's going to make sure everyone knows what you've been doing. I see. Langford's tone was mild, but there was steel underneath. Mrs. Rourke, I understand you're new to Montana, so let me explain how things work here. This is hard country. People fail. Ranches go under. That's not theft, that's reality. And making wild accusations against respected members of the community is a quick way to find yourself unwelcome. Is that a threat? Caleb stepped forward, his hand near his gun. It's advice. Langford's smile never wavered. I've made you fair offers for your property, Caleb, generous offers, considering your circumstances. If you'd taken them, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary.
But instead, you've chosen to make accusations you can't prove, assault my employees, and create a spectacle in front of the entire town. That's not the action of a man with good judgment. Your employees were rustling my cattle, Caleb said through clenched teeth. That's not an accusation. That's a fact. So you say. But in court, without witnesses, the judge believes. Langford let the sentence hang.
Well, we'll see how it plays out, won't we? Sheriff Dugan cleared his throat. Mr. Langford, your men are going to remain in custody until we sort this out. If you've got lawyers, tell them to come by my office tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest everyone goes about their business. Langford inclined his head. Of course, Sheriff. I have complete faith in the legal system. He turned to Caleb and Lila, his smile sharp as a knife. I'll be seeing you soon, I'm sure. Good day. He walked away, his men following, and the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation. Arthur Penn pushed through to Caleb. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Rourke, I'd like to get your full story for the Gazette. This is going to be front-page news. They spent the next hour giving their account to Penn, who took notes and asked sharp questions. When he was satisfied, he promised to run the story in tomorrow's edition and hurried off to his printing office. Isaiah clapped Caleb on the shoulder. You stirred up a hornet's nest, my friend. But you did the right thing. Langford's been getting away with this for too long. Did we do the right thing? Caleb looked at the jail, where Chet, Frank, and Danny were locked up. Or did we just make ourselves bigger targets? Both, Lila said. But we knew that going in. Now we follow through. She turned to the sheriff. What happens next? I hold them, I investigate, and if the evidence backs your story, which it sounds like it does, I'll charge them formal and set a trial date. But Langford's right about one thing. This is going to court, and he's got the money for good lawyers. Then we'd better have the truth, Lila said, because that's all we've got. They drove the recovered cattle back to the ranch, adding them to the herd. It wasn't nearly enough, 49 head now, when they needed 60 or more to have a fighting chance. But it was something, and something was better than the slow bleed they'd been suffering. That evening, after the chores were done and supper was eaten, Caleb and Lila sat at the kitchen table with the ledger spread between them. Lila had been working through the numbers for an hour, her brow furrowed in concentration. Even with the cattle we recovered, we're short, she said finally. If we drive the herd to Denver, we might get enough to make the bank payment, but that's if we get top dollar, which isn't guaranteed. And a cattle drive takes time. We'd be cutting it close, maybe too close. So what do we do? Lila tapped her pencil against the ledger. We need more options. What else does this ranch have that's worth money? Nothing. The land, the cattle, the buildings, that's it. What about mineral rights? Has anyone ever surveyed this property? Not that I know of. My father never thought there was anything worth digging for. Maybe he was wrong. Lila stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark mountains. Langford's desperate to get this land, and it's not just about the grazing. He's too smart for that. There are plenty of other ranches he could buy. So why yours specifically? I don't know. Neither do I, but I think we should find out. She turned back to him. Tomorrow, I want to ride back to that canyon. I want to look around more carefully, see if there's something we missed. It's dangerous. Langford knows we found his rustlers. He'll be watching. Then we'll be careful. Lila's jaw was set. I'm not giving up this ranch without a fight, Caleb. And I'm definitely not giving it to a man like Victor Langford. Caleb looked at his wife. This woman who'd been in Montana for less than 2 days and had already shot a man, exposed a rustling operation, and made an enemy of the most powerful man in 3 counties. He should probably be terrified. Instead, he was starting to believe they might actually have a chance. All right, he said, tomorrow. But we bring Isaiah, and we bring enough guns to make anyone think twice about starting trouble. Deal. That night they lay in the bed with the blanket line between them, both staring at the ceiling. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Caleb? Lila's voice was soft in the darkness. Yeah? Do you ever wonder if we're crazy? 2 strangers trying to save a ranch against impossible odds. Every minute of every day. Me too. She was quiet for a moment. But I'd rather be crazy and fighting than sane and giving up. Agreed. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you asked me to marry you. Even if we lose everything, Even if this all falls apart, I'm glad I said yes. Caleb turned his head to look at her profile in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. I'm glad too. They didn't say anything else, but somehow the silence felt comfortable, like they'd known each other longer than 2 days. Outside, the wind blew cold and the mountains stood dark against the stars. But inside the house, for the first time in months, there was warmth and hope, and the sense that maybe, just maybe, impossible things could be done by desperate people who refused to quit. Morning came with news that spread through town like wildfire. Arthur Penn's front-page story in the Billings Gazette laid out everything: the stolen cattle, the hidden corral, Langford's men caught red-handed, and the allegations of a systematic campaign to drive small ranchers off their land. By the time Caleb and Lila rode into town 3 days later for supplies, the whole territory was talking about it. Some folks looked at them with respect. Others looked away entirely, uncomfortable with the idea of crossing Victor Langford. A few women whispered behind their hands when Lila passed, clearly gossiping about the mail-order bride who'd been rejected and then married a failing rancher the same day. Lila held her head high and ignored them all. They were loading flour and coffee into the wagon when Mayor Gerald Hutchins approached, his round face sweating despite the cold. "Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Rourke, might I have a word?" Caleb set down a sack of feed. "What is it, Mayor?" Hutchins glanced around nervously. "I wanted to tell you that the town council met last night. There's been some concern about the situation with Mr. Langford. Some members feel that perhaps this matter could be resolved more quietly, without involving the courts and creating bad feelings." "Bad feelings," Lila repeated, her voice flat. "His men stole our cattle and shot at us. What kind of resolution were you thinking?" "Well, perhaps if you were to drop the charges, Mr. Langford might be willing to make a generous settlement, enough to cover your banknote, certainly, and perhaps a little extra for your trouble." "In exchange for what?" Caleb asked, though he already knew. "The ranch, naturally. Mr. Langford would purchase it at a fair price. Everyone would walk away satisfied, and we could all move forward without this unpleasantness hanging over the community." Caleb felt his temper rising, but before he could speak, Lila stepped forward. "Let me make sure I understand, Mayor Hutchins. You want us to drop theft charges against men who committed crimes against us, accept money from the man who hired them, and give up our home and livelihood. And you're calling this a resolution?" "I'm calling it practical," Hutchins said, defensive now. "You're new here, Mrs. Rourke. You don't understand how things work. Mr. Langford is an important man. He employs half the town. He sits on every board. He funds the church and the school. Fighting him is like fighting the ocean. You might make waves, but in the end, you'll drown." "Then I guess we'll learn to swim," Lila said coldly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." They finished loading the wagon in silence, both of them seething. As they drove out of town, Caleb finally spoke. "He's scared. Langford must have leaned on him." "Of course he did. That's how men like Langford operate. They use fear and money to make people do their dirty work." Lila's hands were tight on her reins. "But we're not backing down. We can't." "No," Caleb agreed. "We can't." That afternoon, they rode back to the canyon with Isaiah and his 2 sons, Marcus and Joseph. The Boone boys were in their 20s, both built like their father, lean and strong, with the weathered competence of men who'd grown up working hard country. They brought rifles and rope and a determination to help their father's friend however they could. The canyon was empty when they arrived, the makeshift corral torn down, any evidence of the rustlers' presence carefully removed. Caleb wasn't surprised. Langford would have made sure his men cleaned up as soon as the arrests were made. "Spread out," Lila said, dismounting. "Look for anything unusual. Tools, tracks, disturbed ground. Anything that doesn't belong." They searched for 2 hours, working their way deeper into the canyon. Joseph found an old campsite with empty whiskey bottles and cigarette butts. Marcus found fresh horse tracks leading north, toward Langford's main ranch. But it was Lila who found something that made everyone stop cold. She was examining the canyon wall about 50 yards from where the corral had been when she called out, "Caleb! Isaiah! Come look at this." They climbed over to where she stood, studying a section of rock face that looked different from the surrounding stone. It was darker, slightly damp, and when Caleb ran his hand over it, his fingers came away with black residue. "Blasting powder," Isaiah said, rubbing the residue between his fingers. Someone's been using explosives here. Why? Marcus asked. There's nothing to blast in a cattle rustling operation. No, Lila said slowly. But there is if you're looking for something else. She pointed to a narrow crack in the rock face, barely visible behind a tumble of boulders. Help me move these. It took all 5 of them, but they managed to shift enough rock to reveal what was hidden behind. A tunnel entrance, roughly cut, shored up with timber, leading back into the mountain. Caleb lit a torch and stepped inside, the others following. The tunnel was narrow and crude, but it went back 30 feet before opening into a larger chamber. And there, glinting in the torchlight, were unmistakable veins of silver running through the rock. Jesus Christ, Isaiah breathed. That's a fortune. Lila moved forward, examining the walls with focused intensity. This isn't a new discovery. Look at the tool marks. This has been worked for months, maybe longer. They've been extracting ore and hiding the operation. She turned to Caleb. This is why Langford wants your ranch. This silver vein probably runs under your north pasture. He's been secretly mining it, and once he owns your land legally, he can file the proper claims and take everything. So the rustling wasn't about running me off, Caleb said, understanding dawning. It was about bankrupting me, so I'd have to sell cheap. Then he'd own the land, own the silver, and nobody could say a word because it would all be legal. Exactly. Lila pulled a chunk of ore from the wall, the silver clearly visible in the rock. We need samples, we need proof, and we need to file our own mining claim before Langford can. They spent the next hour collecting ore samples and sketching rough maps of the tunnel system. Lila's drawing skills surprised Caleb. Her maps were detailed and precise, showing measurements and angles with professional accuracy. When he mentioned it, she shrugged. I worked in a textile mill. I had to read factory floor plans and understand machinery layouts. This is just different walls and different resources. By the time they emerged from the tunnel, the sun was sinking toward the mountains. They rode hard for town, reaching the territorial mining office just before it closed. The clerk, a bored-looking man named Thaddeus Cole, perked up when they dumped silver ore on his counter. Where did you get this? He asked, suddenly alert. From a canyon on what we believe is an extension of my property, Caleb said. I want to file a claim. Do you have a survey showing the claim area is within your property boundaries? Not yet, but I have maps showing where we found it, and I have witnesses. Caleb gestured to Isaiah and his sons. All 4 of us can testify to the location. Cole examined the ore, then the maps Lila had drawn. This is quality silver. If there's a vein like you're suggesting, we're talking significant value. But filing a claim requires proper surveys, assay reports, legal descriptions. How long does that take? Lila asked. A month? Maybe more, depending on how quickly the surveyor can get out there. We don't have a month. We have 3 weeks until our banknote comes due, and Victor Langford is trying to force a foreclosure so he can claim this land and this silver for himself. Cole's expression changed. Langford's involved? He's been secretly mining this silver for months, maybe longer. We found his operation this afternoon. He's been rustling our cattle to bankrupt us so we'd be forced to sell cheap, then he'd own the land legally and could file proper mining claims without anyone questioning how he knew the silver was there. The clerk was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Finally, he said, I can file a preliminary claim based on what you've brought me. It won't be final until you get the surveys done, but it will establish your priority date as of today. That means if anyone else tries to file on the same area, your claim takes precedence as long as you complete the requirements within 60 days. Do it, Caleb said, whatever it costs. $25. Caleb counted out the money from his dwindling cash and Cole filled out the paperwork. When they walked out of the mining office, they had an official receipt and the knowledge that they'd just claimed something Victor Langford thought was already his. He's going to be furious, Isaiah said as they stood on the boardwalk. You know that, right? When he finds out you filed on the silver, he'll come after you with everything he's got. Let him, Lila said. We've got the law on our side now, both the rustling charges and the mining claim. He can't touch us without exposing himself. Men like Langford don't play by rules when the rules work against them, Marcus said quietly. My guess is he'll try something outside the law. Then we'd better be ready. Caleb looked at his friends. These people who were risking their own safety to help him and Lila. I can't ask you to. You're not asking, Isaiah cut him off. We're offering. You think I'm going to let that bastard steal from good people and get away with it? Besides, if he's been doing this to you, he's probably been doing it to others. This is bigger than just your ranch now. They made plans to increase security. Isaiah and his sons would take turns riding patrol around the Rourke Ranch at night, watching for any sign of trouble. Caleb would keep his rifle loaded and close. Lila would stay armed whenever she was outside. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The week that followed was tense and strange. The Gazette ran a follow-up story about the silver discovery, and suddenly the whole territory knew that the struggling Rourke Ranch might be sitting on a fortune. Prospectors started sniffing around, and Caleb had to run off 2 different groups trying to cross his land to explore the canyons. The bank, which had been pushing for payment, suddenly became much more accommodating, clearly hoping to maintain a relationship with what might become a valuable property. And Victor Langford went quiet. That was the most unsettling part. No more visits, no more offers, no attempts at intimidation. It was like he'd vanished. Sheriff Dugan reported that Langford had posted bail for his 3 men and hired expensive lawyers from Helena, but beyond that, nothing. He's planning something, Lila said one evening as she and Caleb worked on fence repairs. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Quiet men are dangerous men. I know. Caleb hammered in a fence post, then straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. But we can't just sit here waiting for him to make a move. We've still got a ranch to run and a bank payment to make. Which brings us back to the cattle drive. We need to get the herd to Denver and sell them for top dollar. It's our best shot at making the payment and buying time to develop the silver claim. A drive takes at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks if the weather turns. That's cutting it close. Everything we're doing is cutting it close. Lila set down her hammer and looked at him. But we don't have a choice. We gamble on the drive, or we give up now. Caleb nodded slowly. Then we drive them. Isaiah can help, and his boys. We'll need at least 4 riders to manage 49 head over that distance. 5 riders, Lila corrected. I'm going. Lila, don't. We're partners, remember? You don't get to protect me from the hard parts. Besides, you need every hand you can get, and I can ride and work cattle well enough to be useful. She was right, and Caleb knew it. All right, 5 riders. We leave in 3 days. That gives us time to prepare, and still makes Denver with a week to spare before the banknotes due. They spent those 3 days in a frenzy of preparation. They gathered supplies, repaired saddles, checked shoes on every horse. Isaiah and his son spent hours working with the cattle, getting them used to being driven, identifying the natural leaders and the troublemakers. Lila sewed extra pockets into everyone's coats for carrying ammunition and made sure the medical supplies were packed and accessible. On the morning of the drive, they woke before dawn. The temperature had dropped overnight, and frost glittered on the ground like scattered diamonds. Caleb saddled his horse while Lila packed the last of the supplies into the pack mules. Isaiah and his sons arrived just as the sun was breaking over the mountains, their faces set with determination. Last chance to change your mind, Isaiah said, though his tone suggested he didn't think that would happen. We're committed, Caleb replied. Let's get these cattle to Denver and make some money. The first 2 days of the drive went smoothly. The cattle moved well, settling into a steady rhythm once they understood they were going somewhere. The weather held cold but clear, and they made good time across the open country south of Billings. At night, they took turns on watch, 2 riders circling the herd while the others slept. Lila surprised everyone by taking her watch shifts without complaint, and more than once Caleb woke to find her riding the perimeter with the same focused competence she brought to everything else. On the 3rd day, they entered the mountain passes. The trail narrowed, winding between steep slopes covered in pine and aspen. The air grew thinner, colder, and the cattle became nervous, smelling winter in the wind. By mid-afternoon, dark clouds were building to the west, moving fast. Storm coming, Marcus said, studying the sky. Big one, from the look of it. How far to the next valley? Caleb asked. 5 miles, maybe 6. If we push hard, we might make it before the storm hits. But the storm had other plans. It hit them an hour later, coming on suddenly with wind that howled through the passes and snow that fell so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The temperature plummeted, and the cattle started to panic, bawling and milling in confusion. "Keep them together!" Isaiah shouted over the wind. "Don't let them scatter!" They fought the storm and the cattle for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The snow was blinding, the cold numbing, and Caleb could feel his horse struggling beneath him, fighting to keep its footing on ground that was rapidly becoming slick with ice and snow. Then, through the whiteout, he heard gunfire. 4 shots, deliberate and evenly spaced, coming from somewhere ahead in the storm. The cattle heard them too and went wild, stampeding toward the source of the sound in blind panic. Caleb spurred his horse forward, trying to get ahead of the herd, trying to turn them, but it was like trying to turn an avalanche. "They're driving them toward the cliff," Lila's voice cut through the storm, high and urgent. "Caleb, there's a cliff ahead." He couldn't see it, couldn't see anything but snow and the dark shapes of cattle charging past him. Then suddenly the ground ended, and he was pulling his horse back hard, the animal screaming and scrambling as its hooves found air instead of earth. They went down together, sliding in the snow, and Caleb rolled clear just as 3 cattle went over the cliff, their terrified cries dopplering away into silence. Isaiah and Joseph managed to turn part of the herd, splitting the stampede and sending half the cattle back the way they'd come. But the damage was done. 18 head went over that cliff, lost in the storm and the fall. The rest scattered across the mountainside, and through the driving snow, Caleb saw riders disappearing into the white. 4 of them, moving fast, vanishing like ghosts. "Langford's men," Marcus spat, his face furious. "They drove the herd into the cliff on purpose." "Where's Lila?" Caleb was suddenly frantic, looking around wildly. "Lila!" No answer. He called again, his voice cracking, but the wind threw his words back at him. Isaiah grabbed his arm, shouting to be heard over the storm. "We have to gather what's left of the herd. If we lose them all, this was for nothing. I'm not leaving without my wife. We'll find her, but first we save the cattle or we lose everything," Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tear off into the storm searching for Lila, but Isaiah was right. If they lost the cattle now, they lost the ranch, lost everything they'd been fighting for. So he forced himself to turn away, to focus on gathering the scattered, terrified animals, even as every instinct screamed at him to find Lila. It took 3 hours to round up what was left of the herd. By the time they had the cattle bunched and relatively calm, the storm had eased to light snow, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. Caleb counted 26 head. 26. Out of the 49 they'd started with, 18 over the cliff, and 5 more lost somewhere in the mountains. And Lila was still missing. "I'm going back," Caleb said, his voice raw. "I'm going to find her." "We'll all go?" Isaiah said quietly. "But Caleb, it's been hours in this cold. You need to prepare yourself." Caleb didn't respond, just turned his horse and started back along the trail, calling Lila's name until his throat was raw. The others spread out, searching, but as the light faded and the temperature continued to drop, hope faded with it. The mountains in winter were ruthless. If Lila had been thrown from her horse, if she was injured, if she'd gone over the cliff like the cattle, he couldn't finish the thought. Couldn't bear to imagine a future where he'd married a stranger 3 weeks ago and lost her in a Montana blizzard, where the only woman who'd ever believed in him was gone before he could tell her that he was starting to believe in her too. They searched until full dark made it too dangerous to continue. Isaiah finally rode up beside Caleb, his face heavy with grief. "We have to stop. The horses are spent, and we can't help her if we freeze to death ourselves." "I'm not stopping. Caleb, she's alive. She has to be. She's too stubborn to die in some goddamn storm." His voice broke. "She's alive, Isaiah. Then we'll find her in the morning when we can see and when the horses are rested. But right now we make camp, we survive the night, and we pray that she did the same." They camped in a sheltered spot, the cattle huddled against the wind, the men taking turns watching and feeding the fire. Caleb didn't sleep, just stared into the flames and thought about Lila, her sharp wit, her fierce determination, the way she'd shot Frank Ridley without hesitation when he threatened her. She was a survivor. She had to have survived this too. At first light, before the sun had even cleared the peaks, Caleb was back in the saddle. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of white, snow covering everything, smoothing the landscape into alien shapes. They searched all morning, following every trail, checking every sheltered spot, calling until their voices gave out. It was Joseph who found her horse. The gray mare was standing in a narrow defile, reins tangled in some brush, saddle empty. There was blood on the saddle, not much, but enough to make Caleb's heart stop. She fell, Marcus said, examining the ground. Hit her head probably. But look, there are tracks leading away from here. She walked. They followed the tracks, moving as fast as the terrain allowed. The trail led higher into the mountains, winding through rocks and stunted trees, until finally it disappeared into what looked like a solid cliff face. Cave, Isaiah said, pointing. She must have taken shelter. Caleb was off his horse before anyone could stop him, running toward the cave entrance. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person, but it opened into a larger space beyond. He pulled a torch from his pack, lit it with shaking hands, and stepped inside. Lila! The cave went back farther than he expected, the ceiling low and rough. He moved deeper, the torchlight throwing wild shadows, and then he saw her. She was sitting against the far wall, wrapped in her coat, her face pale but her eyes open and focused. When she saw him, she smiled, a tired, relieved smile that made his chest ache. Took you long enough, she said hoarsely. Caleb crossed the cave in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight he probably hurt her, but he couldn't make himself let go. I thought you were dead. I thought I'd lost you. I'm harder to kill than that. She pulled back slightly, wincing. Though I feel like I got trampled. Is everyone else all right? Everyone's fine. The cattle? We lost a lot of them, Lila. 18 over the cliff, 5 scattered. We're down to 26 head. He expected her to be devastated, but instead she just nodded. Then we'll figure something else out. That's what we do. She gestured behind her, and for the first time Caleb realized they weren't alone in the cave. The walls were covered in tool marks, fresh ones, recent work. There were supports shoring up sections of the ceiling, piles of broken rock, and against one wall, a small cache of supplies. And running through the rock like veins of lightning, unmistakable in the torchlight, were thick seams of silver ore. Caleb, Lila said softly, we found Langford's main operation. This isn't a secret mine, this is the mine, and it's massive. Caleb stared at the silver veins running through the cave walls, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The ore wasn't just present, it was everywhere, thick deposits that glinted in the torchlight like captured starlight. This wasn't some minor discovery. This was wealth beyond anything he'd imagined. How long have you been here? He asked Lila, his voice rough with emotion and relief. Since yesterday afternoon. My horse stumbled during the stampede and threw me. I hit my head on a rock. She touched a nasty bruise on her temple. And by the time I got my bearings, the storm was too thick to see through. I remembered seeing this cave entrance when we passed earlier, so I made my way here for shelter. She gestured around the chamber. I didn't realize what I'd found until I lit a fire and the light hit those walls. Then I started exploring. Isaiah appeared at the cave entrance, torch in hand, with Marcus and Joseph right behind him. They stopped dead when they saw the silver. Mother of God, Isaiah breathed. That's more wealth than 10 ranches put together. That's why Langford's been so determined. Lila stood up slowly, favoring her left ankle. This vein probably runs under your entire north pasture, Caleb. He's been secretly extracting it for months, maybe longer, while systematically destroying you financially so you'd be forced to sell. Once he owned your land legally, he could file proper mining claims and take everything without anyone questioning how he knew the silver was here. And the rustling, the stampede. Caleb's anger was building now, hot and fierce. That was all just him trying to finish what he started. Those riders in the storm weren't an accident, Marcus said grimly. They were trying to destroy your herd completely, leave you with nothing. They nearly succeeded. Caleb looked at Lila, seeing the exhaustion in her face, the bruises and scrapes from her fall, the determination that still burned in her eyes despite everything. But you found this instead. You found the evidence that'll destroy him. We need to document everything, Lila said, moving deeper into the cave despite her obvious pain. Look here. This isn't just surface mining. They've got tunnels going back into the mountain, support timbers, ventilation shafts. This is a full operation that must have taken months to set up, and they've been doing it in secret on what they thought was Langford's land, but is actually an extension of yours. How can you tell it's my land? Joseph asked. Because of where we are. Lila pulled out the map she'd drawn days ago, now creased and smudged. She spread it on a flat rock and pointed. This is your north boundary, Caleb, and this is where we found the first tunnel. The property line runs right through here, which means this cave and probably most of these tunnels are on your side of the boundary. Langford's been mining your silver and trying to bankrupt you so you'd never know it was there. Isaiah studied the map, then looked around the cave with an experienced eye. We need a proper surveyor to confirm it, but if you're right, and I think you are, Langford's committed trespass, theft, and fraud on a massive scale. This isn't just rustling cattle anymore. This is criminal enterprise. Then we document it all, Caleb said. Every tunnel, every tool, every ounce of ore we can find. We take samples, we draw maps, and we bring it all to the sheriff and the mining office. We bury him with evidence. They spent the next 4 hours exploring the cave system. It was extensive. 3 main tunnels branching off from the central chamber, each one carefully shored up and showing signs of recent work. They found mining equipment worth hundreds of dollars, or already extracted and stacked for transport, even a small smelting setup hidden in one of the deeper chambers. Lila sketched everything with meticulous detail while the men collected samples and made notes about locations and dimensions. He must have been planning this for over a year, Marcus said, as they examined one of the larger tunnels. You don't set up an operation like this overnight. Which means he's been watching your ranch for at least that long, Isaiah added. Probably longer. He knew about the silver before you ever took that loan from the bank. Caleb felt sick. So the loan was probably his idea, filtered through the bank. Get you to borrow money for expansion, then make sure you couldn't pay it back. It's elegant, in a ruthless sort of way. Isaiah's expression was dark, and it almost worked. It still might work if we don't move fast, Lila said. She was pale, clearly exhausted and in pain, but still focused. We have 19 days until the bank payment is due. 26 cattle won't bring enough to cover it, even at top dollar. We need another plan. The silver, Joseph said. Can't we sell some of the ore? Not legally, not yet. Lila shook her head. Our mining claim is preliminary. Until we get the surveys done and the claim is finalized, we can't legally sell ore from this site, and that process takes weeks we don't have. Then what do we do? Caleb looked at the woman he'd married less than a month ago, this stranger who'd become his partner, and now might be the only thing standing between him and complete ruin. We're out of cattle, out of time, and out of options. Lila was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she said, We don't go after the bank payment. We go after Langford directly. We force him to settle. How? We take everything we found here, the maps, the samples, the evidence, and we go to Sheriff Dugan and the Territorial Mining Office. We file formal charges for trespass, theft, and illegal mining. And we make it very clear that if Langford doesn't withdraw his pressure on the bank and compensate us for the cattle he's stolen and destroyed, we're going to prosecute him so hard he'll lose everything. She met Caleb's eyes. We don't just defend anymore. We attack. He'll fight back, Marcus warned. Men like that don't go down without taking everyone they can with them. Let him fight. Lila's voice was steel. We have the law on our side now. We have evidence and we have truth. And if he's stupid enough to try something violent, we have witnesses and weapons. Either way, he loses. They emerged from the cave into late afternoon light, the sky clear and cold after the storm. The cattle were grazing nearby, the remaining 26 head looking thin and exhausted, but alive. It wasn't enough to save the ranch the old way, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough to buy time for the new way. They made camp that night in a sheltered valley, rotating watch shifts and keeping the herd close. Lila insisted she was fine, but Caleb could see her favoring her ankle and touching her head gingerly when she thought no one was watching. He made her sit while he tended the horses and helped with the cooking, and for once she didn't argue. You scared me, he said quietly as they sat by the fire later, the others already asleep or on watch. When I couldn't find you, when I thought... He couldn't finish. I know. Lila's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cold but strong. I was scared too. Not of dying. I've made my peace with mortality. But scared that I'd die before we finished this, before we beat Langford, before I could prove that taking a chance on you was the smartest thing I ever did. Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd been abandoned and humiliated, who'd married a stranger out of desperation, who'd shot a man and discovered a fortune and survived a blizzard all in the space of 3 weeks. How are you so brave? I'm not brave. I'm just too stubborn to quit. She smiled slightly. And I learned a long time ago that the only person who's going to save you is yourself. Everything else, partnerships, friendship, even love, those are bonuses. But the core strength has to come from inside. Is that what this is? Caleb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Love? Lila was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I know I'd fight for you. I know I'd die for this ranch we're building together. I know that when I thought I might not make it out of that cave, the thing that hurt most was imagining you alone, facing Langford without backup. She squeezed his hand. Maybe that's love. Or maybe it's just partnership taken to its logical conclusion. Does it matter which? No, Caleb said, and realized it was true. No, it doesn't matter. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the fire burn down to embers while the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood guard against the night. The ride back to Billings took 2 days, moving slowly to accommodate the battered herd and Lila's injuries. When they finally rode into town, it was mid-morning and Main Street was busy with regular commerce. People stopped to stare at their reduced herd, at Lila's bruised face, at the grim determination in every rider's expression. They went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Dugan took one look at them and ushered them inside, calling for coffee and chairs. They spread their maps and samples across his desk, while Isaiah and his son secured the cattle in a holding pen. Tell me everything, Dugan said, and they did. It took an hour to lay out the whole story, the stampede, the cave, the mining operation, the evidence of Langford's systematic campaign to steal the ranch. Dugan listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing darker as the tale unfolded. When they finished, he studied the maps and ore samples in silence. This is big, he finally said, bigger than rustling, bigger than claim jumping. If you're right about the property boundaries, Langford's been conducting illegal mining operations on your land for months and using criminal methods to drive you off so he could claim it legally. That's conspiracy, theft, fraud, trespass. Hell, I could probably add a dozen more charges if I thought about it long enough. Can you arrest him? Caleb asked. I can bring him in for questioning, but arresting him is different. He's got lawyers, political connections, money. I need this case to be airtight before I make that move, or he'll walk and I'll look like a fool. Dugan tapped the maps. You need that survey done, and you need it fast. Official documentation that proves the mine is on your property, not his. We have a preliminary claim filed, Lila said. Doesn't that count for something? It counts for establishing priority, but it doesn't prove location. You need a certified surveyor to verify the boundaries. Dugan leaned back in his chair, thinking. There's a man named Robert Finch who does survey work for the territory. He's honest, competent, and he owes me a favor. I can get him out to your property within a week if I push. A week might be too long, Caleb said. The bank payment's due in 19 days. If Langford can pressure the bank to foreclose before we get that survey, none of this matters. Then we need to move on multiple fronts. Lila's voice was crisp, organized. Sheriff, you bring Langford in for questioning based on what we've found. Make it public, make it loud. We want everyone in town to know he's being investigated. That puts pressure on the bank to hold off on foreclosure. They won't want to be seen as complicit if Langford's being charged with crimes. Meanwhile, she continued, we get the surveyor out as fast as possible and document everything officially, and we file additional charges with the Territorial Mining Office for illegal extraction and trespass. We hit him from every angle at once. Dugan smiled slightly. You've got a head for strategy, Mrs. Rourke. I've got a head for survival. Strategy is just survival with planning. Lila stood up, wincing as her ankle protested. How soon can you bring Langford in? This afternoon. I'll send my deputy to fetch him now. Dugan stood as well, settling his gun belt. But you folks should know, once I do this, there's no going back. Langford's going to come after you with everything he's got. legal and otherwise. You sure you're ready for that fight? Caleb looked at Lila, saw the determination in her face, the refusal to back down. Then he looked at Isaiah and his sons, these friends who'd risked their own safety to help. Finally, he looked back at Dugan. We're ready. Then let's do this. Word spread fast that Victor Langford had been brought in for questioning by the sheriff. By the time Caleb and Lila left the office to check on the cattle, half the town was buzzing with gossip. Some folks looked pleased, small ranchers and farmers who'd probably been victimized by Langford themselves. Others looked worried, nervous about what would happen when you challenged the most powerful man in 3 counties. They were settling the cattle when Arthur Penn from the Gazette found them. Mr. Rourke, Mrs. Rourke, I heard Langford's been arrested. Is it true he was running illegal mining operations? He hasn't been arrested yet, Lila corrected. He's being questioned about evidence we discovered during our cattle drive. Evidence that suggests he's been systematically destroying our ranch so he could steal valuable resources from our property. Penn's pencil was already moving across his notebook. What kind of resources? Silver, a substantial deposit that runs under our north pasture, which Langford has apparently been mining in secret for months. My God. Penn looked up, his eyes bright with the scent of a major story. Do you have proof? We have maps, ore samples, and direct evidence of mining operations on our land. We've filed formal complaints with both the sheriff and the Territorial Mining Office. Lila's voice was calm, factual. The truth is going to come out, Mr. Penn. The only question is whether it comes out in an orderly way through the legal system or in a messy way through scandal and conflict. Can I see the evidence? Not yet, but you'll get the full story as soon as it's appropriate to release it. For now, I'd suggest you start asking questions around town. How many other ranchers have lost cattle mysteriously? How many have been pressured to sell to Langford at below-market prices? How many foreclosures has the bank pushed in the last 2 years? And how many of those properties ended up in Langford's hands? She met his eyes. There's a bigger story here than just our ranch, Mr. Penn. And I think you're the right person to tell it. Penn grinned. Mrs. Rourke, I like the way you think. I'll start digging. As he hurried off, Isaiah came over with a troubled expression. That was either very smart or very dangerous. Both, Lila said, but we need public opinion on our side. If this turns into a he-said-she-said battle, Langford's money and influence will win. But if we can show a pattern of predatory behavior, if we can get other victims to come forward, then it becomes a community issue instead of a personal grudge. You're assuming other people will have the courage to stand up to him, Caleb said. I'm assuming that courage is contagious. We stood up, others will follow. She was right. Over the next 3 days, as word spread about the investigation and Penn's articles started appearing in the Gazette, people began coming forward. A rancher named Thomas Whitfield reported losing 30 head of cattle over 6 months, then being pressured to sell to Langford. A widow named Margaret Chen described how the bank had suddenly called in her husband's loan right before he died, and how Langford had been there within a week making an offer. A farmer named Luis Vargas talked about vandalism and sabotage that stopped the moment he agreed to lease his water rights to Langford. The stories painted a picture of systematic predation, of a powerful man using every tool at his disposal, legal and illegal, to expand his empire at the expense of struggling neighbors. And with each new testimony, public sentiment shifted. Langford wasn't just being questioned about one crime anymore. He was being revealed as the architect of a campaign of intimidation and theft that had touched dozens of lives. The surveyor, Robert Finch, arrived on the 4th day. He was a precise, methodical man in his 50s who spent 2 full days walking the property lines, taking measurements, and consulting ancient territorial maps. When he finished, he sat at Caleb and Lila's kitchen table and delivered his verdict. The cave and approximately 80% of the mining tunnels are definitively on your property, Mr. Rourke. The boundary line runs about 30 yards north of the main chamber, which means Mr. Langford has been conducting extensive illegal mining operations on land he doesn't own. Finch produced a detailed map with the boundaries clearly marked. This is now official documentation, registered with the Territorial Office. Your preliminary claim is validated, and you have legal standing to pursue both mining rights and damages. Lila actually smiled, the first real smile Caleb had seen on her face in days. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. How much do we owe you?" "Sheriff Dugan's already settled my fee. He said to consider it an investment in justice." Finch tipped his hat. "Good luck, Mrs. Rourke. From what I hear, you're going to need it." Armed with official surveys and mounting public pressure, Sheriff Dugan finally made his move. He arrested Victor Langford on charges of conspiracy to commit theft, illegal mining, trespass, and criminal mischief. The arrest happened in broad daylight on Main Street, with half the town watching. Langford's face was a mask of cold fury as Dugan read the charges, but he went without resistance, his lawyers already scrambling to post bail. "This isn't over," Langford said as he passed Caleb and Lila on the boardwalk. "You've made a powerful enemy, and you're going to regret it." "We already have powerful enemies," Lila replied calmly. "You're just the latest. And Mr. Langford, we don't regret fighting back. We only regret that we didn't do it sooner." Langford's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more as Dugan led him away. His lawyers got him released within 3 hours, but the damage was done. The arrest was front-page news. The territorial governor's office sent an investigator. The bank, suddenly desperate to distance itself from any appearance of impropriety, sent a representative to the ranch to discuss flexible payment arrangements. The bankman, a nervous fellow named Wilkins, sat across from Caleb and Lila in their kitchen and explained that the bank was willing to extend the loan for an additional 6 months at reduced interest, given the recent discoveries on the property. "In other words," Lila said dryly, "now that you know there's silver here, you're suddenly much more accommodating about the cattle loan you were ready to foreclose on 2 weeks ago." Wilkins flushed. "The bank simply wants to be fair. The bank wants to protect its interests now that those interests have changed." Lila pulled out a piece of paper and slid it across the table. "Here's what we want. A 12-month extension on the current loan at 1% interest, with no payments due for the first 6 months while we develop the mining claim. In exchange, we'll grant the bank right of first refusal on any future loans related to mining operations. I'll have to consult with my superiors. You do that. And while you're consulting, remember that we have documentation showing the bank pressured us toward foreclosure while Victor Langford was actively sabotaging our ability to pay. That's going to look very bad when the territorial investigator starts asking questions about collusion." Lila's smile was sharp. "So I suggest you consult quickly and come back with an answer we can all live with." Wilkins left, looking shaken, and Caleb turned to his wife with something like awe. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" "Textile mill, remember? I watched the owners play games with workers' lives for 6 years. I learned how to play back." She stood up, stretching. "The difference is, they were playing for profit. We're playing for survival. That makes us more dangerous." The bank agreed to Lila's terms within 2 days. The extension gave them breathing room, time to properly develop the mining claim, time to recover from the losses they'd suffered, time to rebuild the herd. More importantly, it signaled that the balance of power had shifted. They weren't desperate victims anymore. They were property owners with valuable resources and the will to fight for them. Langford's trial was set for spring, but his lawyers were already working on a settlement. Word came through unofficial channels that Langford was willing to pay substantial damages for the cattle lost and the trespass violations, in exchange for Caleb and Lila not pursuing criminal charges that might result in prison time. "He's scared," Isaiah said when he heard. He'd come by to help with fence repairs and stayed for supper, his sons with him. "A man like that doesn't offer settlements unless he knows he's going to lose." "The question is whether we accept," Caleb said. "Part of me wants to see him in prison for what he did." "Part of me does too," Lila admitted. "But the practical part recognizes that a settlement gets us guaranteed compensation now, while a trial is uncertain and could drag on for months. We need to rebuild. We need to hire workers and buy equipment and develop the mine properly. That all costs money we don't have yet." "So we let him buy his way out?" Marcus sounded disgusted. "We let him pay for his crimes in a way that helps us more than a prison sentence would," Lila corrected. "Justice comes in different forms. Sometimes it's punishment, sometimes it's restitution, and sometimes it's just making sure the person who hurt you can never hurt you again." They negotiated through lawyers for 2 weeks. When the dust settled, Langford had agreed to pay $8,000 in damages, enough to restock the herd, buy mining equipment, hire workers, and give them a comfortable cushion against future disasters. He also signed a legal document acknowledging the Rourke property boundaries and relinquishing any claim to the silver deposits. In exchange, Caleb and Lila agreed to drop the criminal charges and accept a permanent restraining order that forbade Langford from coming within a mile of their property. "It's not perfect," Lila said as they signed the settlement papers, "but it's enough." "More than enough," Caleb agreed. "It's victory." That night, with the settlement signed and $8,000 deposited in the bank under their names, Caleb and Lila sat on their porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was cold but still, and smoke rose straight from the chimney into a sky painted orange and purple. For the first time since they'd married, nearly 2 months ago now, though it felt like both a lifetime and a moment, the weight of imminent disaster wasn't pressing down on them. "We did it," Caleb said quietly. "We actually did it." "We did." Lila's hand found his, their fingers interlacing naturally now, without thought. "Though I'm still not entirely sure how. Stubbornness, luck, and you being smarter than everyone else in 3 counties. She laughed, a real laugh that made something warm bloom in Caleb's chest. "I'm not smarter. I'm just more desperate, and desperate people see angles that comfortable people miss." She squeezed his hand. "But we're not desperate anymore, are we?" "No," Caleb agreed. "We're not." The next weeks passed in a blur of purposeful activity. With money in the bank and the threat of foreclosure lifted, they could finally focus on building instead of just surviving. They hired 2 ranch hands, young men named Tom and Sam, who'd been working odd jobs around Billings and jumped at the chance for steady employment. They bought 20 head of quality breeding cattle from a rancher in Helena, animals that would form the foundation of a rebuilt herd. They purchased mining equipment and hired an experienced mining engineer named Hans Mueller to properly develop the silver claim. Mueller was a German immigrant in his 60s who'd spent 40 years extracting precious metals from mountains across the West. He took one look at the cave system and declared it some of the richest silver he'd ever seen. "With proper development, this could produce for 20 years or more," he said, his accent thick but his English clear. "But we must be careful. Mining is dangerous work. We need proper shoring, ventilation, safety protocols. No shortcuts." "No shortcuts," Lila agreed. "We do this right, or we don't do it at all." They expanded the house too, adding 2 rooms and a proper kitchen, replacing the leaking roof and fixing the sagging porch. Lila hired a carpenter from town, a skilled craftsman named James Chen, Margaret Chen's son, who worked with precision and pride. The house began to feel like a real home instead of just a shelter against the weather. One morning in early February, Caleb woke to find Lila already up and standing at the window, silhouetted against the dawn light. He watched her for a moment, this woman who'd transformed his life so completely he could barely remember what it had been like before her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She turned, and he saw she'd been crying, not sad tears, but something else. "I was thinking about the day I arrived here, how I sat on that platform in my ruined dress, believing my life was over. How the worst moment I'd ever experienced turned into the doorway to something I never imagined possible." She crossed to the bed and sat beside him. "I was also thinking about how we never talk about us, about what we are to each other." Caleb sat up, suddenly alert. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're partners in business. We're partners in fighting. We share a bed and a life and a future, but we've never actually discussed what that means." She met his eyes. "We got married out of desperation, Caleb. We made a deal. But somewhere along the way, at least for me, it stopped being just a deal and started being something more." His heart was pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you." The words came out simple and clear, no hedging or uncertainty. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you first offered to marry me instead of walking away. Maybe when you searched for me in the blizzard. Maybe gradually over 100 small moments. But it happened, and I needed you to know." Caleb realized he was holding his breath. "I love you too," he said, and felt something unlock in his chest as he said it. "I've been afraid to say it because I didn't want you to feel trapped, like you had to return feelings you didn't have. But Lila, I've loved you since you shot Frank Ridley without hesitation, since you stood up to Langford in the middle of Main Street, since you survived a blizzard and came out the other side with maps and ore samples and a plan. You're the bravest, smartest, most impossible woman I've ever met, and I love you completely." She kissed him then, really kissed him, not the chaste pecks they'd exchanged on their wedding day or the brief touches of affection that had become casual between them. This was different, deep and honest and full of all the feelings they'd been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lila smiled against his lips. "Good," she whispered, "because I was prepared to argue my case if you disagreed." He laughed and pulled her close, and they stayed like that as the sun rose fully over the mountains and flooded the room with light. Two people who'd found each other in desperation and chosen to stay together in hope. By March, the ranch was thriving. The new cattle were settling in well, the hired hands were competent and hardworking, and Muller had the mining operation running safely and productively. They were extracting silver at a steady rate, and the ore assays came back consistently high quality. The money started flowing in, not a fortune yet, but steady income that meant security, breathing room, the ability to plan for a future instead of just surviving day to day. The town's attitude toward them shifted too. What had started as skepticism, people unsure whether to believe the accusations against Langford, had transformed into respect as the evidence mounted and the settlement was made public. Caleb and Lila weren't outcasts or troublemakers anymore. They were the couple who'd stood up to corruption and won, who'd turned disaster into opportunity, who'd proven that desperate people with nothing to lose were the most dangerous opponents of all. One Saturday in late March, they rode into town for supplies and found a small crowd gathered outside the train station. Curious, they tied up the horses and walked over to see what was happening. A young woman sat on the same bench where Lila had sat 4 months earlier, sobbing into her hands. Her dress was travel-stained, her hair disheveled, and her eyes were red and swollen. Standing nearby, looking uncomfortable, was a rancher named Dale Pritchard, shaking his head and talking to another man. "She's not what I expected," Pritchard was saying. "I sent for someone young and pretty, and what shows up is this plain creature with rough hands and no education. I can't marry that. I've got standards." The woman flinched at his words, and Caleb felt Lila go rigid beside him. "How much do you want to bet he conveniently forgets to mention he's 53 years old, balding, and his ranch is 2 steps from bankruptcy?" Lila said quietly, her voice tight with anger. "Don't," Caleb warned, recognizing the look in her eye. "It's not our business." "The hell it isn't." Lila walked straight over to the bench and sat down beside the crying woman. "What's your name?" The woman looked up, startled. Sarah Mitchell. I'm Lila Rourke. 4 months ago, I was sitting right here in your position. The man who'd brought me out to Montana took one look at me and decided I was too fat, not what he ordered, not worth his time. He rode away and left me with nothing." Sarah's eyes widened. "What did you do?" "I married a different man, a good man who saw past the surface to what mattered. We've built a life together, a real life, not the fantasy some coward like Dale Pritchard pretended to offer." Lila glanced over at Pritchard, who was watching nervously. "You deserve better than a man who judges you on appearances and breaks promises before even giving you a chance. And I know exactly where you can find that." Caleb closed his eyes, knowing what was coming. When he opened them again, Lila was walking toward him, Sarah Mitchell in tow, and he couldn't help but smile. "Don't say it," he warned as they approached. "I'm going to say it anyway." Lila turned to Sarah. "This is my husband, Caleb. And he knows at least 3 good, honest men who are looking for wives and would never treat you the way Pritchard just did. One of them is a rancher named Thomas Whitfield, widowed 2 years ago, lonely as hell, and the kindest man you'll ever meet. He's got a good spread, 3 horses, and a dog named Bear who's better company than most people." "Lila," Caleb tried to interject. "Another is James Chen, the carpenter who's been working on our house. He's smart, hardworking, and his mother's been trying to find him a wife for 3 years. And the third is Sam, one of our ranch hands. Young, yes, but steady and decent and looking to build something permanent." Sarah was staring at Lila like she'd descended from heaven. "You're serious? You're actually dead serious. You came all this way for a chance at a new life, and you're going to get one. Just not with the jackass who doesn't deserve you." Lila looked at Caleb. "Tell me I'm wrong." Caleb sighed, but he was smiling. "You're not wrong. Thomas is lonely.
James could use someone sensible in his life, and Sam's been talking about finding a wife since the day we hired him. He looked at Sarah. Do you want to meet them? No pressure, no promises.
Just introductions, and you can decide for yourself. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face again. But different tears this time. Tears of relief and hope. Yes. Please, yes. Dale Pritchard started to protest, something about contracts and agreements, but Lila turned on him with such ferocity that he actually took a step back. She doesn't owe you anything, Lila said, her voice cold and sharp. You broke faith the moment you rejected her based on appearance. Now get out of here before I tell everyone in town exactly what kind of man you really are. The kind who uses mail-order advertisements to lure desperate women west, then treats them like livestock at auction. Go. Pritchard went, muttering under his breath, and the small crowd that had gathered applauded. Arthur Penn appeared from somewhere, notebook already out, clearly delighted by this development. They took Sarah back to the ranch, fed her lunch, and let her rest while they sent word to Thomas, James, and Sam. All three men showed up the next day, nervous and eager in bringing small gifts. Thomas brought wildflowers, James brought a carved wooden box he'd made, and Sam brought fresh bread from his mother's kitchen. Sarah met with each of them separately, talking on the porch while Caleb and Lila gave them privacy. When she was done, she sat at the kitchen table with a dazed expression. They're all wonderful, she said. How do I choose? You don't have to choose today, Lila said gently. Take your time. Get to know them. See who you connect with naturally, and if none of them feels right, that's fine too. The point is you have options, Sarah. You have choices. That's what you came west for, isn't it? Freedom to choose your own future? Sarah stayed at the ranch for 2 weeks, helping with chores and getting to know the three men. In the end, she chose James Chen, drawn to his quiet kindness and the way he listened when she talked. They married in April, and Lila stood as witness, feeling like she'd somehow repaid the universe for the chance Caleb had given her months earlier. You're going to keep doing this, aren't you? Caleb asked as they rode home from the wedding, finding abandoned brides and matching them with good men. If I can, yes. Why shouldn't I? Lila looked at him. There are too many women out there desperate for a chance, and too many men who don't know how to find them. If I can make a few good connections, prevent a few more women from experiencing what I experienced, why wouldn't I? No reason, Caleb said, and meant it. You've got a gift for seeing what people need and making it happen. Might as well use it. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch continued to prosper. The mining operation was producing steady income, the cattle herd was growing, and they'd built a reputation as fair employers who treated their workers well. People came looking for jobs, and Caleb and Lila hired carefully, building a team of competent, loyal employees who took pride in their work. Mueller reported that the silver vein was even larger than initial surveys suggested, potentially running under several thousand acres. This could support multiple families for generations, he said. You've not just found a mine, Mr. and Mrs. Rourke. You've found a legacy. But with prosperity came new responsibilities. They needed to think about expansion, about how to manage growth without losing the personal touch that made their operation successful. They needed to plan for equipment maintenance, worker safety, market fluctuations. The problems of wealth were different from the problems of poverty, but they were still problems. One evening in July, they sat on their rebuilt porch, now sturdy and level, with proper chairs and a view that stretched for miles, and discussed the future. We need to make some decisions, Lila said. She had a ledger open on her lap, numbers written in her precise hand. The mine's producing more than we need for personal expenses. We can reinvest in expansion, or we can diversify, buy more land, invest in other businesses, fund community projects. What do you want to do? Caleb thought about it. 6 months ago, his only goal had been survival. Now he had the luxury of planning beyond the next payment, beyond the next crisis. It was both liberating and slightly terrifying. I want to help people, he said finally. People like us, the ones barely hanging on, the ones facing foreclosure or disaster or impossible odds. I want to use what we have to give them the same chance we got. Lila smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. I've been thinking about starting a lending cooperative, small loans at fair interest for ranchers and farmers who can't get traditional bank financing. We provide the capital, they provide the work, and everyone benefits. That's brilliant. It's practical. And it helps build a community where people support each other instead of everyone fighting alone. She closed the ledger. But there's something else we should discuss, something more personal. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. What? I'm pregnant. The world seemed to stop. Caleb stared at his wife, trying to process what she'd just said. You're pregnant? About 3 months along, from what the doctor says. I wanted to be sure before I told you. She was watching his face carefully. Are you happy about it? Happy? Caleb stood up, then sat down, then stood again, unable to contain the sudden surge of emotion. Lila, yes, I'm happy. I'm terrified and overwhelmed and completely unprepared, but I'm happy. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, like she might break. We're going to have a baby. We are. She pulled back to look at him. I know we never discussed children. I know this wasn't part of the original deal. The original deal stopped mattering months ago, Caleb interrupted. This isn't a business arrangement anymore. This is a marriage. This is a family. And I want this baby more than I knew it was possible to want anything. Lila's eyes filled with tears. Good. Because I want it too. I want to build something that outlasts us, Caleb. I want to create a future where children grow up safe and loved and free to choose their own paths. I want our child to know they came from people who fought for what mattered and never gave up. They will, Caleb promised. We'll make sure of it. The baby, a girl they named Margaret Rose, after Lila's mother and Caleb's grandmother, was born in February, exactly 1 year after Caleb had found Lila crying on that train platform. She came into the world screaming with outrage, strong and healthy, and when the doctor placed her in Lila's arms, Caleb saw his wife cry tears of pure joy for the first time since he'd known her. She's perfect, Lila whispered, staring at their daughter with wonder. She's absolutely perfect. And she was. Margaret had Lila's dark hair and Caleb's blue eyes, and from the beginning she showed signs of having her mother's fierce determination and her father's steady patience. She was loved absolutely by everyone on the ranch. Tom and Sam treated her like a precious treasure. Muller carved her wooden toys with German precision, and Isaiah's wife Martha made her a quilt that became her favorite possession. As Margaret grew, the ranch grew with her. The lending cooperative Lila had started was helping a dozen families stay afloat, and several of them had paid back their loans and were thriving. The mine continued to produce, and they'd expanded operations carefully, always prioritizing safety over speed. The cattle herd numbered over 200 head now, quality animals that produced healthy calves and steady income. They'd bought adjacent land as it came available, expanding their holdings to include 3,000 acres of good grazing and valuable mineral rights. Other miners had approached them about developing some of the remote areas, and they'd negotiated fair partnerships that provided income without requiring them to do all the work themselves. Victor Langford had left Montana 6 months after the settlement, relocating to California where his reputation hadn't preceded him. His former properties were sold off piecemeal, and several of the ranchers he'd tried to destroy ended up buying their own land back at fair prices. Justice wasn't always immediate, but it had a way of working out eventually. One morning in late summer, when Margaret was 6 months old and starting to crawl, Lila was working in the garden when she heard a commotion from the direction of town. She picked up Margaret and walked around to the front of the house just as a wagon pulled into the yard. In the wagon sat 3 women, all of them looking tired and uncertain. The driver, a freight hauler named Pete Jackson, whom Lila knew casually, climbed down and tipped his hat. Mrs. Rourke, these ladies were asking in town about you, said they'd heard you helped women who were in bad situations. I figured I'd bring them out since I was heading this way anyway. Lila looked at the 3 women, one older, maybe 40, with work-roughened hands, one young, barely 20, with a baby in her arms, and one middle-aged with a black eye she'd tried to hide with powder. She recognized the look in all their eyes. Desperation. Determination. Hope. "What are your names?" she asked gently. "I'm Elena Vasquez," the older woman said. "This is Annie Porter and her baby, and that's Ruth Chambers. We heard you married a rancher after being abandoned, and that you help other women find decent situations. We're all We're all running from something. Bad marriages, bad situations, bad choices. We heard Montana was a place where people could start over. It is, Lila said. She shifted Margaret to her other hip and smiled. Come inside. Let's talk about what you need, and we'll figure out how to help. Caleb came in from the barn an hour later to find his kitchen full of women, all of them talking and laughing over coffee and fresh bread. Lila caught his eye and gave him a look that said both sorry and not sorry, and he just shook his head with amused resignation. How many this time? He asked quietly as he passed her. 3. Elena has experience with bookkeeping, Annie's good with children and looking for work as a nanny, and Ruth is a seamstress. I'm thinking Elena might be good for the mining office. Muller's been complaining about the paperwork. Annie could help Martha Boone with her grandchildren, and Ruth might be interested in starting a tailoring business if we could help her get established. And if any of them want husbands? I know at least 5 good men who are looking, but that's their choice, not ours. Lila smiled at him. We're just providing options, Caleb. The rest is up to them. You're going to fill Montana with rescued women and reformed bachelors, he said. But he was smiling too. Someone should. Might as well be us. The women stayed for 2 weeks while Lila helped them find their footing. Elena took the bookkeeping job with enthusiasm, immediately organizing Muller's chaotic records into comprehensible systems. Annie moved in with Isaiah and Martha and became indispensable in managing their household and grandchildren. And Ruth, after meeting several potential suitors, decided she preferred independence and started a tailoring business in town with a small loan from Lila's cooperative. By autumn, when Margaret was taking her first wobbling steps and the ranch was preparing for winter, Lila had helped 9 women find new lives in Montana. Some married, some didn't. All of them found work, community, and the chance to rebuild lives that had been broken by circumstances or bad choices or simple bad luck. You know what you're creating, don't you? Caleb asked one night as they watched Margaret sleep in her cradle. You're building a network, a community of people who help each other, who give second chances, who refuse to let anyone fall through the cracks. That's the idea, Lila said. One person can't change the world, but one person can help another person, and that person can help someone else. And eventually you've got something that looks an awful lot like change. She leaned against him. We were desperate once. We know what it's like to have nothing and need everything. Why shouldn't we use what we've built to help others in the same situation? No reason at all, Caleb agreed. I'm proud of you, of us, of everything we've built together. From nothing, Lila added. We built it from nothing but desperation and stubbornness and the refusal to quit. That's all you really need sometimes. They stood there in the quiet darkness of their daughter's room, 2 people who'd found each other in the worst moment of their lives and chosen to transform that moment into something extraordinary. The ranch was thriving, the mine was producing, the community they'd built was growing. They had wealth, security, love, and a future that stretched bright and wide before them. But more than any of that, they had each other. A partnership forged in desperation and tempered by adversity, stronger now than either of them could have imagined on that cold November day when a failing rancher had offered his last $50 to marry a woman nobody else wanted. Outside, the Montana wind blew cold across the mountains, carrying the scent of coming snow. Winter was approaching again, the same ruthless winter that had nearly destroyed them a year ago. But this time, they were ready. This time, they had resources and people and plans. This time, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And when spring came again, as it always did, they would still be here, building, growing, helping others find the same second chances they'd found in each other. The land was still hard, the mountains still unforgiving. But for the people Caleb and Lila Rourke welcomed into their lives, Montana had become exactly what they'd hoped it would be. A place of new beginnings, chosen family, and the kind of love that transforms impossible odds into extraordinary outcomes. The story that had started with shame and rejection on a train platform had become a story of redemption, partnership, and the fierce determination of 2 desperate people who refused to let the world break them. And in the end, that refusal had made all the difference.